Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode of the award-winning Everything Compliance. We're absolutely thrilled for two reasons today. We have back our long-lost colleague, Mr. Jonathan Armstrong, and we have a special guest, Karen Moore. Karen, first of all, welcome back.
Thank you. Always happy to be here.
All right, Mr. Armstrong, with your return of the prodigal son, we will ask you to lead us off.
Thanks very much, Tom. Thanks, listeners. Thanks, you all, and good to be back. And I think you'd asked me to give a brief rundown of the EU AI Act and where we were with that at the moment. It's important to remember that despite what you read in the media and despite those tweets that we're seeing that say the act is in and people need to comply, bunkum, it isn't. But the first thing to say, I think, is that AI is not the Wild West in Europe that people think it is. We've already had a number of cases where regulators have looked at AI, usually using GDPR powers. So we've had the suspension of ChatGPT on a temporary basis, an ongoing investigation by the guarantor into ChatGPT, which may lead to a more permanent suspension. We've had the suspension of Replica AI, another chatbot. We've had fines in various European jurisdictions against Clearview AI, a facial recognition operation. And we've also had fines for food delivery apps like Foodino and Glove app in Italy and in Spain. So there's already been a significant amount of regulatory activity. And in most cases, regulators are using existing GDPR principles. So the principles of fairness, lawfulness, and transparency, particularly. And they've been fairly innovative in adapting it. So in the Foodino case, for example, they said that because the algorithm gave preferential treatment to riders and deliverers of food who would work Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, an intentional consequence of that was that the app was racially discriminatory because the Sabbath of most mainstream religions would be on a Friday, a Saturday, or a Sunday. And they also looked at things like the always on nature of a lot of AI. So just because you can get a constant stream of where somebody is using geolocation doesn't mean to say you should. And again, I think with AI, that's one of the real messages. And I know we've discussed it before, but I've been on the NYSBA AI task force. Our report's now out. If anyone wants it, just drop me an email. But we've looked there at more of the should we rather than the can we elements of AI. I mean, one thing that I think Matt's going to talk about that I'm particularly passionate about is that AI, though, because it's difficult, doesn't mean to say that many corporations can opt out. There are clear opportunities with AI. So it isn't a fact of just saying, oh, we won't go near it, because that in itself might lose competitive advantage. So with that introduction, turning to the EU AI Act, it reached political agreement in December 2023. It's been a somewhat fraught process. And I think it's always going to be a difficult piece of legislation because in some respects, the innovation in AI is moving faster than the politicians discussing it. So we saw changes at a very late stage proposed by countries like France and Germany because the pace of innovation was so quick. It's going to be about 2 years until the act is fully in force, but some organizations can volunteer to effectively sign up to the legislation early. This is the so-called AI Act. My suspicion is that there won't be many takers for that. Those that are might be the ones in the deepest trouble. So there's an investigation, for example, into the antitrust competition law aspects of AI. And it might be that a big tech corporation that feels under pressure from an antitrust point of view might elect to join the AI Pact. But for most corporations, they'll have another 18 months or so to prepare. But that doesn't mean to say they should be complacent. Obviously, any AI application that they're building now will have to comply with the legislation if its shelf life is going to be longer than about 18 months. So it's a regulation, not a directive. So the same as GDPR, which means that in theory, the AI Act will be the same across all EU member states. As a side note, it won't apply in the UK. Rishi Sunak's on a long courtship with Mark Zuckerberg, which means that the UK is sort of going light on AI regulation. Some say it's the longest job application in history, with Sunak perhaps thinking that he's out of a job in November, and the election results this morning would have probably hastened that demise. And we'll see him, no doubt, brushing up his LinkedIn profile even as we speak. The Act adopts a risk-based approach. So in simple terms, it categorizes different aspects of AI. And in some respects, it adopts a similar approach to GDPR in that you'll have to do an impact assessment. You'll have to look at the potential ramifications of the AI application that you're bringing in and what you can do to minimize that. Like GDPR, the Act will have extraterritorial reach, and GDPR enforcement will be at member state level. And this is where we're likely to see differences throughout Europe. As I've said already, we've had the Granta in Italy and the APD in Spain go fairly heavy on AI enforcement. We've also had investigations in parts of Germany, in Greece, and GDPR enforcement tends to be fairly patchy, and the AI Act enforcement is likely to be fairly patchy as well. I think there'll be a ramp up period. Many of the regulators don't have the technical expertise that they need. So I don't think we'll see big cases initially, but I think we'll see big complaints initially. And if I was a betting man, I'd say that Max Schrems's name will be on some of those complaints. And the fines, again, similar to GDPR, but higher. So fines of up to 35 million euros or 7% of global annual revenue. So the intention is there's quite a lot of beat behind this. Now, of course, for corporations, as I've said, now is the time they're going to have to prepare. I think there are a number of issues. I've looked particularly at the issues around training data. So a lot of organizations have a fairly convoluted supply chain for their AI applications, where they're contracting oftentimes with a big tech company who's then procuring training data to train the AI application that they're then embedding. But there are some real issues there. There's one provider of data called Common Crawl that's a sort of not-for-profit, seems to have the majority of the market in training data. And some of the training data wasn't gathered for that purpose. Things like the replica AI case tell us that there's a lot of unsuitable stuff that's being used to train chatbots. For those of you who didn't follow it, replica AI is the chatbot that basically encouraged youngsters to engage in sexual language and sexual activity, and then was the center of a criminal case in the UK where a vulnerable individual said that replica AI, or his replica AI chatbot, had told him to go and kill the Queen, and he was arrested outside Windsor Castle. So he said, about to follow up on the instructions of his chatbot, and all sorts of particular issues with chatbots like that, and the alleged involvement of the Russian state in some of that activity. So I think it's not an easy job for people to make their AI applications compliant. And of course, for many compliance professionals, they don't know the AI that's being used in the business. And that, again, is an issue that they're going to have to address. So if you're a chief compliance officer, you need to be knocking on the door of the tech team, asking them what AI they're deploying. I'd ask HR and recruitment as well, because from my experience, that's where we're often seeing a lot of AI applications already. And you're going to have to do that diligence, I think, of reaching out to the organization to find out the applications that are already in place and retrofit compliance to them.
Jay Rosen, do you have a question for?
Actually, I do. And welcome back, Jonathan. Vis-a-vis your EU clients, are they being proactive or reactive in terms of what's happening in the marketplace?
Yeah, good question. I think the reality is it depends. I know that just before I went away 3 weeks ago, I did a session for one of the world's biggest tech companies that was trying to get ahead of this. And we had a really great session, I thought, looking at some of the risks and some of the opportunities. But other people are behaving ostrich-like and thinking, I've got another 18 months, I've got another 2 years, I'll worry about it later. And again, that's a similar pattern that we had with GDPR. There was the sort of deniers and those who thought that they needed to get ahead of it. And of course, there are business opportunities sometimes with getting ahead of it as well. So it's a mixed bag, to be honest, Jay.
Thank you.
All right. Matt Kelly, what is on your mind this week?
Somewhat picking up on Jonathan's Armstrong, laying the groundwork for what are the regulatory issues here. And while it's coming out of Europe, I think the structure of the EU AI Act is probably going to be very similar to what we end up with in the United States. So
I think Matt brings up some really great points. And I think one of the things that we're going to have to really take a step back on, as Matt said, is how are the boards going to be able to monitor this going forward? And how does that seep through the organization? I'm going to talk about this in my segment, but there are some groups out there that shall be nameless that are trying to pilot some of this. So it's going to be interesting to see how effective that is. And then I guess my question for Matt is, my big fear always, and I think Karen, you mentioned this maybe indirectly or indirectly, my memory's sort of bad these days, but it's, if you don't have the right individuals that are responsible for this, and you have this over reliance on artificial intelligence, either at the board level or any other level, I think that's a recipe for disaster. So I just wanted your thoughts.
I think so too. And it gets to yet another fundamental question about board governance is, who are you, the board, relying on from management to brief you on what these issues are? And for a lot of emerging issues, I think the CEO is going to try and really keep a very tight spigot on that information pipeline. And he or she will be the one who briefs the board on these things. Even if the board has the wherewithal to say, we want to report on AI, who should that be? Should it be the of IT security? Should it be the chief technology officer? Who's going to get to make that decision? And I think a lot of times the CEO is going to step up and say, you know what, I'll tell you what you need to know about that. I'm very uncomfortable with that idea, but it certainly happens all the time in large companies, partly because I'm not sure that a lot of large companies have a good grasp on who is in charge of AI development in-house either. So maybe by default, the CEO is going to do this bad habit. I think it is still a very muddy mess.
Look, I think we still have a problem with people understanding the definition of internal control.
Yeah.
I think the other issue we have is there's a lot of shadow AI as well. Just as we have shadow IT, people in the organization are going out and picking their own solutions. And it's, as I said, it's a really difficult job for the chief compliance officer to know who's doing what. And then you compound it with the fact that most boards aren't appropriately set up to look at the risk. And we've said it on these podcasts endlessly. Boards need to be more diverse. That's diversity of ground, it's diversity of origin, but it's diversity of skills as well. And we tend to have cookie cutter, male, stale directors, and we need to change that. And that's one of the reasons. But there is to declare an interest. Obviously, one of the things I elevate is to try and look at the next generation of non-exec directors. But there is this real skills gap. I know EY did a survey in 2022 where they said that 35% of boards admitted they lacked an understanding of AI-related risk. And 61% of Fortune 100 companies were seeking the cybersecurity expertise on their board. And tech isn't something that boards do well. From my experience, we've had a data breach, for example, where you've got a 70-plus-year-old lead non-exec director who, for various reasons, has to take, control of the investigation. And at the first meeting, I have to help him switch his iPad on. These are people who are not digital natives. And if we had a board composition that didn't include anybody with financial expertise, and we said, oh, we leave all that to the auditors and we just trust them, you'd be regarded as a lunatic. And yet we make the same mistakes with having nobody on the board who can assess risk and opportunity with AI, with cybersecurity, with Internet of Things, all sorts of other tech-related risks and opportunities for boards. But they've got to get with the program, and boards have got to modernize. It's critical for them.
It's funny, Jonathan Armstrong, your point, if the company just said, we don't do anything about the finances, we just listen to the auditor and what the CFO tells us, not only would you have a big mess, like you'd have the SEC on hold on line one. That is just horrible. And I do think soon enough, regulators, either in the United States or in Europe, also, if you say something so glib and you're so cavalier with AI, you're going to have regulators for call holding on line two about that lack of oversight. And it is something that I am fully confident most boards are aware that there is a maturity curve they need to get on and get up fast. But I don't know how many of them are going to get up that curve at the appropriate speed, which I think is going to be a pretty high here. And we shall see.
Correct.
All right. Karen Moore, what's on your mind this week?
Well, even though I'm trying to keep a really broad eye on a whole number of things, I keep getting caught out by surprise. So what's on my mind is the somewhat unexpected April 7th proposal by Republican Representative Kathy Rogers and Democrat Senator Maria Cantwell proposing an American Privacy Rights Act. So we've got both a bipartisan and bicameral proposal. It's early days, but it seems to have gotten some pretty good traction in legislative discussions mid-April. So we'll see. So I wanted to try and get a little ahead of the curve and take a look at the complexities of this proposal, many of which I'm sure will change, but particularly as they relate to artificial intelligence. And I'm going to start with what I think is kind of a fun one, which is part of the preemption clause. The current draft does contain a preemption clause that says this is going to be a federal law and state laws are no longer going to apply, which California, among others, is obviously not happy about. So we might see some further dilution of that. There are already a set of listed. The AI related one that I like, which seems bizarrely specific, is that the preemption clause would not preclude actions pursued under state criminal laws. That I wrote the language down here, that intimate images, including authentic or generated by a computer or by artificial intelligence known to be consensual, would not be superseded by the act. So I guess if there are any naughty images that have been generated by that involve your personal rights somehow, that could still be pursued under state criminal laws. I kind of like that was one of the two really specific AI references in the entirety of the act. Okay. The bigger one that specifically referenced pertains to automated decision making, which will then implicate changes potentially to all of the way a lot of companies are operating. The automated decision making provisions define covered algorithms, which include those that have been created by or with the involvement of AI, and which make decisions with or without human intervention, which I know is a big part of some of the privacy laws, and particularly one of the key bugbears in the EU. But if they're used to make a determination regarding the provision of services or products or ranking, I have the language here: ordering, promoting, recommending, amplifying, or similarly determining the delivery or display of information to an individual, there are a whole bunch of requirements that are then imposed. And because automated decision making is starting to become a really common use by a large range of operations with a company. And I think Jonathan Armstrong already referred to this in the context of the AI Act in the EU, is that there are a lot of parts of the organization that aren't even aware that they're using automated decision making. So trying to collect those all in and then deciding how we're going to make sure that we're complying if this remains as is with the APRA will be interesting, because if you are using any covered algorithm, which is pretty broadly defined, the developers, first of all, have to conduct a design evaluation prior to the release of the algorithm. And then the companies who are using that algorithm have to provide a notice that algorithm is being used. And most importantly, I think, and difficult to manage, an opportunity for the individual to opt out of the use of that algorithm. Now, that is limited to what are called consequential decisions. And those are decisions, there's kind of a heavy civil rights, human rights element to that, because those consequential decisions are decisions relating to the access to equal employment, housing, employment, education, enrollment, healthcare, insurance, credit, et cetera. So it will be somewhat limited, but managing an opt out, I'm going to say, is akin to managing the data subject access requests, that you're going to have this kind of complexity of how are you actually going to organize that, and maybe need to even use an AI model in order to manage the notice and opt out itself. And then I think equally importantly and potentially somewhat burdensome is the obligation, if you're using one of these covered algorithms, to conduct an impact assessment, which we're seeing more and more often in different contexts, especially in privacy laws. That impact assessment would, in the AI context, need to provide a pretty detailed description of the design process, the methodology, contain a statement of purpose, a description of the data used to train the model, which is maybe more or less foreign, but the decision-making process itself, from my understanding, tends to be somewhat part of a black box and very hard. The explainability component can be really difficult. And then the people that are using these kind of algorithms also have to demonstrate the steps that they're taking to prevent harm to minors, which is a pretty big focus of the draft law generally, bias and access to needs like, again, housing, education, or public accommodation. So that automated decision-making component, I think, is a really big one. It's going to be interesting to see how that survives various iterations of this draft. And then we've got two carved out groups in the APRA with a slightly elevated level of accountability or responsibility. One really not, well, both really not surprising. One being high impact social media companies. Those are defined as companies that provide internet based services that individuals use in individual or user shared content. You have to have more than 300 million individuals monthly and more than 3 billion in global annual revenue. So I guess we can identify who these high impact social media companies are. In those cases, the browsing data is automatically classified as sensitive data or sensitive information, which is going to impact its use in modeling and also transfer and use by data brokers. So there's another kind of AI implication there. And then the second carved out group are what is identified as large data holders. Mostly those are entities with annual revenues in excess of 250 million and that are processing the information of more than 5 million individuals. So you can see some pretty large companies are going to get caught up in that. There's a kind of elevated impact assessment on the algorithms that is implicated there. If those algorithms pose a consequential risk of harm to the individual, I could see a lot of healthcare companies and providers there. And there's some increased transparency obligations. So again, just things that need to be moved on. And then the third kind of really large bucket that touches on artificial intelligence in the APRA. It doesn't specifically mention it, but there are data minimization requirements. Those data minimization requirements are not unusual to anybody working with GDPR. They're kind of common principles that are already seen in both the GDPR, CPRA, and others. So data minimization is important, but this is kind of a blanket one. Data minimization really informs the least amount of information needed to accomplish a stated purpose. So you're supposed to now limit the information that you're collecting. I don't know about you, but it feels like these days, if I'm even buying theater tickets online. They're asking for my blood type and all sorts of other information, completely unnecessary to my forking over a huge amount of cash for the opportunity to see Ray Fiennes perform Macbeth, which we had the privilege of doing last week. So that was kind of nice. But signing up for supermarket loyalty programs, it just becomes kind of excessive. So the data minimization principles do make sense, but they do have potential, arguably negative consequences for artificial intelligence. Developers who are creating and training models need robust and pretty significant data. So the more you minimize the data, arguably, the more difficult it is to come up with data sets that can accomplish what they need to accomplish. The responses to that have been to use anonymized or aggregated data sets so you can still minimize the data or minimize the impact. You can locally host some of the language modeling that's being used so that it's not being aggregated specifically. So there are all sorts of technical solutions to data minimization and AI models, but it's arguably difficult or makes AI development and use of data sets more problematic. Potentially, I've seen some interesting commentary coming out of the EU, potentially creating more biased data sets because the data is limited. So I don't know. The tension between data minimization and AI is not new, or it's not brand new, at least raised by this. It's something that's been grappled with in the EU for a while, with GDPR throwing up all sorts of challenges. That tension between data minimization and creating robust data sets for AI usage has been around for a while. I've done a couple of really interesting articles. Tom, I can provide you if you want to stick the links up on the site. There's some interesting IBM research out of Haifa University, and there was also a pretty good comprehensive with example article by Sarah Goldberg at IAPT, or shoot me an email and I can send them. So where we are on this is still very early days. Implications for AI are there. All we have, as usual, the EU is taking the lead here. All we have in the US right now is really comprehensively an executive order regarding AI, which says that privacy has got to be paramount if we're developing AI legislation. So it remains to be seen what the AI implications of the APRA will be, or how the APRA will progress, if it will progress. I'm hoping it will progress, because even an imperfect federal data privacy law is going to be better than 50 state different direction privacy laws, but we'll see where it goes. I mean, a couple of things. One is I'm a bad predictor because I made all sorts of noise about the CSDDD when it was first came out. And then I months later predicted its demise as Germany and Italy were strongly opposing it, only for it to come back to life really quickly. So who knows how quickly this may or may not pass through the process. I will note that the current draft only provides 180 days to implementation. So starting to think about this now isn't a bad thing, especially if you aren't already looking at the EU AI Act and GDPR. If those don't apply to you, you might want to start taking a look at this. If you're already looking at GDPR and the EU AI Act, you're probably way ahead of the curve already, depending on where we go with the APRA. So we'll see. The two need to work in tandem, but the concept of comprehensive and integrated data governance for large corporations, I think, is becoming more and more important. We can't leave this all to the compliance officer to address. That's where we are.
All right. Mr. Marks, you've been lurking around with some comments and questions. What do you have for us?
So let's kind of push all this aside for a second, and we'll talk about artificial intelligence, sort of optimizing internal controls and how that might play out. We've spoken about how it's being increasingly acknowledged for its disruptive potential in the field of obviously controls and within a dynamic realm of corporate governance. So I'll get into some of that, but going back to what I said before, internal control, according to me, is a process of interlocking activities designed to support policies and procedures that detail the specific preventive, detective, and so on and so forth. Moreover, policies and procedures serve as the raw material for internal control, which is a process rather than an object. But AI itself, when you take a look at this, has the capability of quickly and precisely scrutinizing vast amounts of data. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, but so it can almost revolutionize the execution of some controls, not all controls, some controls. And the current role of artificial intelligence, I think I might have mentioned before that there are some internal audit shops that are playing around with that. But I think for our listeners today, I really want to get into sort of methods for successfully at least starting or execution, because I think we talked around some of these ideas, some of our other thought leaders on today's call, our podcast. So to optimize, at least in my mind, the way I'm thinking about this, the impact of AI on internal controls, I would look at first data quality and accessibility. What are the sources of truth? The cornerstone of any successful AI application is the data that is of superior quality and that is available to us. If that doesn't happen, everything else is useless. So organizations must ensure that data is inputted into AI systems in both accurate and a comprehensive way to prevent incorrect outputs that could potentially undermine specific control mechanisms. And again, speaking from the hip here, and then we talked about from before having the right people. So skill development. I think that's really critical too. I think it's essential to develop internal capabilities to effectively handle these AI tools and accurately analyze these results, which means that some of this is going to be trial and error. You're going to be building models. You might be using machine learning and natural language processing and things like that. So there's some sensitivity around all of that as well. But it's going to take folks not only to understand what these things are, but to speak up if they're not working or they're not as effective as they potentially can be. So I think that that's really sort of data quality is one, skill development. And then I sort of led into this sort of that ethical considerations and the bias mitigation. So I do think it's imperative to acknowledge and tackle the ethical ramifications and inherent biases that present themselves in certain AI algorithms. So you really get to have people that understand this. So it's crucial to create AI systems that are open, fair, and responsible in order to preserve what we'll call stakeholder trust that upheld the ethical norms of the organization. And then the last thing that I think probably we should really consider is the collaboration piece of this. And I think a lot of organizations are forgetting about that. It's like when you do a system install, you just can't buy a system off the shelf usually and plug it in and think it's going to work. There's a lot of collaboration that goes back and forth with the tool provider or the system provider. So partnering with respected technology providers in this particular space, providing companies with customized solutions that meet their specific internal requirements, I think is probably a good thing to start thinking about and doing. And then these collaborations, based on what I've seen over my career, can offer continuous assistance to the company as the intelligence and as the capabilities really emerge. I think it could be really great. I think if you're in internal audit today and you're thinking about internal controls, I think if you're not at least starting to think about how you can infuse this technology into your controls and use that as an advantage through continuous auditing or continuous monitoring type protocols that you might have, you're going to get lost. And it may become a level of, maybe somewhat an expectation that these things are starting to meander their way into the internal audit realm, either shortly or at least more predominantly as we see cases like this one financial institution start to publish or come out where they have been successful in dealing with these transaction reviews and using natural language and machine learning and artificial intelligence to really tackle some of the more critical things with regards to, like, for example, I live in the world of fraud, developing patterns or trends or anomalies. AI, it's going to continuously learn. Those are some of the things that are going to happen more quickly than probably a human could do. There are some really significant advantages of really thinking about this, but I think to kind of cut to the chase, because I know we're very short on time today, the incorporation of artificial intelligence into internal controls, at least from my perspective, represents really pivotal advancements, effectively managing the intricate nature of organizations and the vast amount of data that we all have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. You can really improve your control mechanisms and make more informed decisions by implementing AI technology properly. And I use that word properly because, again, anything, if you have garbage in, garbage out. In the future, the deliberate integration of AI into internal controls, I think, will be a crucial factor in determining the success and effectiveness of an organization's overall governance. I think the boards really need to be educated on this and how it can play a key role in enhancing the control environment as companies work more towards what I call a risk resilient enterprise-wide ecosystem. And so these are just some of the things that I'm thinking about with regards to AI and internal controls. And I think based on what Jonathan has put forth and what Matt has put forth and what Karen has put forth, I think those things really need to be understood and thought through as well as we enter this new realm.
All right, Jay Rosen, what's on your mind?
Thanks, Tom. I'm going to be talking about AI like most everyone touched on this morning. And I wanted to start off with an oldie but goodie. Does anybody remember receiving an urgent email or text saying that your boss or CEO of the company needs you to purchase $2,100 Starbucks gift card? This was a very unsophisticated but believable fraud that happened in the early aughts. The era of artificial insistence in corporate crime is now here. The compliance departments must ensure that they're prepared. Last month, the Department of Treasury issued a detailed report highlighting that AI is redefining cybersecurity and the fraud in the financial services sector. Here's a recent example. The Hong Kong office of an unnamed multinational recently lost $25 million when several fraudsters joined a live video conference posing as firm personnel. They already deceived the employees on the call by using deepfake software to impersonate colleagues, including the firm's CFO. Companies' existing compliance programs and business risk mitigation policies may no longer be sufficient to address emerging AI risks. There are three key areas that I'd like to talk about this morning: real-time deepfakes, AI-enabled barrier evasion, and manipulation of the company's AI models. These three areas arise from the availability of new tools, but the tactics are well known to corporate compliance personnel. Several corporate mitigation strategies can allow companies to address these new, rapidly expanding threats. First of all, deepfake technology, which convincingly replaces audio or video of one person's likeness with the likeness of another, and they have introduced a new wrinkle to these schemes. Threat actors often impersonate a company executive or vendor and use a fake or hacked email to trick a company's employees into sending money. Training efforts have therefore emphasized email as a vehicle for potential fraud and mitigation policies. Deepfakes have amplified the risk of impersonation. Instead of an email, suppose a target employee receives a text message from the CFO directing the employee to join the call. Preventing improper access to sensitive information is a task similar to many corporate compliance departments. AI tools have made it easier for bad actors to discover these gaps. Corporate chatbots, for instance, can be given access to internal corporate data that employees access by chatting with AI systems. The chatbot given access to these sensitive data might divulge in response to a routine prompt without employees even knowing the possibility. Lastly, AI systems are being increasingly relied upon to drive vital business processes such as sales and investment models. Companies' recent shift to AI-enabled key performance indicators, for instance, means that AI systems are being used to gain a holistic sense of their business performances. Here's a couple of other examples of what could go wrong. Rogue employees might try to tamper with these systems, for example, manipulating algorithms and artificially boosting their performance matrix. Here's a mitigation strategy for deepfakes. To address the risk associated, companies should consider implementing the following measures. First of all, from a training perspective, employees who transfer large sums of money and send out confidential information or handle passwords should be trained in deepfake technology. These employees should be trained that any request made by audio or video could be proof fraudulent, and it has one of the following hallmarks. One, it arises from a typical source. Two, it involves a large sum of money or highly sensitive information. An employee keeps the request confidential or is asked to not tell anyone, and then an element of urgency like the initial example above. All these involve transfers of funds to a new bank account or confidential information to an unfamiliar address. Training should also include ways to detect real-time video deepfakes, like asking the person to turn to the side, as the current technology struggles to generate realistic profile views. Any suspicious request should be independently viewed by one or more of the following means. A person should be face-to-face for verification. The requester may display or may be asked to display two pieces of identification, implementing in predetermined code words or challenge questions, and requiring a second person to sign off on certain categories. Companies should ensure that existing information walls and permissions are applied to the data made available by the systems. Companies should follow the least privilege principles by limiting access to sensitive information only to those employees who genuinely need to interact with it. And finally, companies can use red teaming, which is a process of engaging a team of experts to probe systems of vulnerabilities. Here is to access the threat of model manipulation. Companies' departments may consider the following policies. Dual authorization. Companies can limit the amount of single employees to a certain system, and this improves their ability to detect improper changes as well as inadvertent errors made by the system. The maker-checker process, for example, requires that a checker approves any changes that seem to be implemented to the system. All tools for their promise also provide evolving ways to exploit a company's vulnerability and to compromise their systems for personal benefits. Corporate compliance departments should consider these heightened risks in their evolving AI situations and include risk mitigation as they plan their strategies. So hopefully by taking some of these actions, we will avoid the situation of being asked to go out and get Starbucks tea. Tom?
All right. We are off to our fan favorite shout outs and rants. Mr. Kelly is facing a hard stop, so we're going to ask you to go first, Matt. Then we'll go back to the same order.
Thank you very much, Tom. First, I have two rants, actually. A very quick one on the American privacy rights, which, if you shorten that to an acronym, is APRA. That's terrible. Clearly, this law should have been called the American Right to Privacy Act, which would then be pronounced ARPA. And I can't believe they missed that. That is yet another sign of America's political dysfunction. But actually, I wanted to spend more of my time ranting about South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, who is making headlines this week for a book she is trying to publish, which has not even been published yet. It has already been panned for one of the stories in the books where apparently she talks about a puppy that she had that could not be trained. So she took it out back and I just have to say, I'm in full disclosure, I am not a dog person. I do not like the dog that we have in my family. I don't dislike him either, but I'm certainly not going to take a dog out and shoot it. And maybe the people who do care for dogs could tell me if I'm wrong, but I thought if you had a dog that was not trainable, you would give it away to somebody else who could better handle the dog. And I get it. If you have a family with small children, you don't want a dangerous dog on your property. I would put the dog on somebody else's property who wanted it and who could handle the dog. I would not put the dog in a gravel pit with a 22 slung over my shoulder. There are some other problems in her book, apparently, that she claims that she had met the North Korean dictator, Kim Jong-un, It has since been proven that actually she never has. And now her spokesman is saying that the publisher is going to correct inaccuracies in the books by the time it's published. It just seems to me that she has made a very poor start to what obviously was a vice presidential nominee. I don't think that's going to happen. I think she's lost the dog caucus. I think she's probably lost the North Korean dictator caucus too. I don't know who else is left for her trying to get her onto the vice presidential ticket. But anyways, I just think that he is not ready for prime time. And as bad as your life might be, people, it could be worse. You could be her dog. And that's all I have to say this week.
Where is Sarah Palin when you need her? Jonathan Armstrong, you've had 3 weeks to make up an appropriate commentary. What do you have for us?
You'll be surprised to know I haven't been thinking about this for the whole of the 3 weeks. But I think the last time we were on, I criticized Kate Middleton for the way in which she had handled this Photoshop debacle. And it's right and proper that I say that she's handled the news of her cancer diagnosis with great dignity and in a entirely appropriate and professional way. And my thoughts and prayers are with her and her family.
Karen Moore, what do you have for us?
I've got a shout out to the Buffalo Bills, who selected former Rugby Union player 23-year-old Travis Clayton in the 7th round of the draft. He's going to play offensive lineman, or at least tried. He has never played a game of football before. He's coming through the International Player Pathway Program. I think he's the second rugby player to do so, but maybe the first who's never played rugby before. I do have it on reliable information that the scouts very often are looking at track and field athletes for speed, but that has not been a really successful outcome because they're just not used to getting tackled. If you're running a fast mile, you are not doing it with any obstruction. So Travis Clayton did clock 4.79 seconds in the 40-yard dash in the draft combine. He's certainly used to getting tackled. So I'm going to wish Travis Clayton a lot of success, but really shout out to the Buffalo Bills for some mild risk taking and thinking out of the box.
Jonathan Marks.
Hi, I'm going to give a shout out to Miss Maureen Stanko, who lives not too far from a town that I spent many years of my life, Pennsylvania, and her son, Nick, who is 20 and is on the autism spectrum. And Maureen did something that I think is absolutely remarkable. She actually opened up a cafe. It's called So Much to Give Inclusive Cafe in Pennsylvania. And they employ about 60 people. 80% of the employees have a disability, and they work as greeters, food runners, sous chefs, dishwashers, and servers. And people with disabilities now actually go there to hang out and have a meal because they feel very comfortable. And I just think what she has done is absolutely just fantastic. And so the next time I'm in the area, I will guarantee you, Maureen, that I will stop by and patronize your facility and give you a little donation. Thank you for doing that. It's quite remarkable, like I said.
Jay Rosen.
I will also have a sports related shout out in saying that this is my favorite time of the year because you have the NBA and the NHL playoffs, you have the WNBA, you have Major League Baseball. And as Karen knows, after the draft, we're going to have organized team activities. I just invite everybody to go and geek out and watch some sports.
I'm going to shout out to the pinball wizard, Pete Townshend, and at least in my top 5 albums of all time, the rock opera Tommy, which has reappeared on Broadway in 2024, introducing a new generation of listeners to, in my mind, one of the greatest albums of all time. It has been nominated for Best Revival of a Musical. It was first made into a musical in 1993, and that version won 5 Tony Awards. The album has been introduced or rather inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. I can't believe there's a living human being that doesn't have that album, but apparently there are people who didn't or weren't teenagers in the 60s and 70s. Shout out to Pete Townshend. Shout out to the Pinball Wizard with the greatest acoustic guitar opening solo of all time. And shout out to the first rock opera.
Can I just say, Tom, I was privileged to go and see The Who live for what might have been their farewell tour last summer, and he's not lost it.
I saw that same tour, and you're correct. With that, thanks everyone. I can't wait till we get together next time.